What is an outfeed table? An outfeed table is just a table or bench that sits at the end of a tool, in my case my table saw, to help support the workpiece during a cut and prevent it from falling off the tabletop like this. Since our garage workshop is on the smaller side, my outfeed table will also be my assembly table and a general workbench that acts as a central hub in the shop. Besides its main purpose as a workstation, it also needs to look good. We spent months building this shop from the ground up, and while the primary goal with this space has always been function, form also matters. It is, after all, the space where I'll create, making the furniture and built-ins that I've been dreaming up in my head for years. And I do believe that the space we inhabit has an effect on how we think and feel, and how we think and feel affects what we create and put out into the world. My hope with this build is to create a table that combines form and function, one that blends seamlessly into the overall aesthetic of the shop, but that is also adaptable and can adjust with changing needs. One of my main challenges with this build is trying to create a large piece of functioning furniture without having a workbench to build it on. My solution to this problem was to design it in sections, so that I will essentially be creating 5 separate cabinets that sit on top of a base raised above the floor that gets combined to make up the full-size table. This way I can tackle each cabinet as its own separate smaller build and then put it all together. Cabinets are also relatively easy to make, so I know I can bang out a set of them pretty quickly, and with so many projects ahead of us, time is always a factor. To keep the build simple, I decided to build the cabinet boxes with butt joints and pocket holes. If you're not a woodworker, all that means is I'm going to avoid any sort of fancy joinery, and opt to just hold the parts together with screws driven in at an angle, and rely on wood glue to hold it together long term. Since my cabinets are going to get joined together to make a table, many of the sides will never be seen. As such, I opted to go for cheaper plywood on the sides that will remain hidden, and only use the more expensive birch plywood on the fronts and sides that will be exposed once it's all assembled. For the top of each cabinet carcass, I just added a couple of stretcher strips. There's no need for a solid piece of plywood here since it's going to be covered by the top, which in this case is going to be a solid sheet of plywood. All I need is something to hold the shape of the box together and something to screw the top into. Most of these cabinets are going to have drawers. Drawers are not the most beginner-friendly project, but they aren't hard to get right. It just takes some practice and thoughtful planning. I'm making mine out of 1/2-inch pre-finished birch, and I start by cutting a groove into all of the sides that will support the 1/4-inch bottom panel. Three sides of the box then gets assembled before I slide in the bottom panel and then attach the final side of the drawer box. I'm again using glue and pocket hole screws to build these boxes, which allows me to move through them pretty quickly. The biggest challenge with drawer boxes is getting them to fit into the cabinet carcass just right. Side-mounted drawer slides do not have much play as far as fit. If you build the boxes slightly too wide, it'll be tough to pull the drawers in and out. If the boxes are slightly too narrow, they may fall out of alignment with the sliders, again hindering the smooth operation of the drawers. I do plan on going into more detail on how to build a drawer in our next video, where I'll be building a router table cabinet, and I had the time to cover that particular part of the process more carefully. But just to touch on the method I've had success with here, I lay out the parts of my drawer inside the carcass, stacking the drawer slides next to each other, followed by the 2 side panels, and lastly the front and back panel, placing them in the box in the orientation they'll be when installed. When preparing these pieces, I make sure to slowly sneak up on my cut, purposely cutting the front and back panels of the drawer boxes a little too wide and test fitting as I cut them down until things glide smoothly. If it all works when the pieces are separate and unassembled, it should also work when the boxes are all put together. I work all of this out before assembling the drawer box because once the glue cures, the box can't be adjusted easily. Once my boxes were built, I could move on to installing them into the cabinet carcass. There's many different ways to approach this, including a handy and cheap Craig jig that I've used in the past, but for this build I was able to just use some scraps of cutoffs to align the sliders and boxes, since these cabinets are short and pretty small. There's a lot to consider here in order to get the fit just right, but I'll try not to bore you with any more over-explaining. With the boxes installed, all that was left for the cabinets were fronts. I again like to sneak up on my cuts and test fit as I go so I can make sure the reveal between the fronts is where I want it to be. Once I'm happy with the size of my fronts, I can lay it all out, clamp it together, and screw them into the drawer boxes. With the cabinets complete, I was ready to move on to the base. I'm going to be using construction grade 2x4s to keep the cost down, and since I recently bought my first jointer, I was able to clean up the boards, flattening all sides and faces pretty easily, making rough Home Depot lumber look like something much better. For the legs, I doubled up the wood to make a thicker 4x4-like post. To put the base together, I opted for dominoes, but you could just as easily use pocket hole screws here as I did with the cabinets. I figured the dominoes would ensure a more accurate fit without having to fuss with trying to keep it aligned. I did, however, fail to realize I don't have clamps long enough to hold it all together and glue up, so I had to improvise, attaching a block to the middle and using 2 smaller clamps to finish the job. I'll later remove the block from the underside of the apron, and with the cabinets installed on the top of the base, you'll never see the leftover screw holes. Once the base was built, I put a nice and rich black stain on it all and added these feet levelers to the legs. The floor in our shop is not totally flat, with some significant dips in the center of the room where this table will sit. Now, if you've seen our previous video, you know we dug a trench to bury dust collection for the table saw and outfeed table underground. Here's where that comes into play. This entire setup needs to fit under the table, so I designed it with enough clearance to sit above the dust collection hoses and gates. Just enough. Aaron built me these amazing smart blast gates that open and close when its corresponding tool is used. This central island will have 3 blast gates, one for the table saw, one that provides suction to a built-in port in this outfeed table I'm building, and one for the router table cabinet, which is the next project I'll be tackling. With all the dust collection set up, we could finally put this table together. I decided it would be best to assemble the cabinets in sections so that I could ensure a flat and even top. Since the tabletop will be resting on the cabinet tops, it was essential that everything remain even and flat. When I was milling my cabinet sides, I made sure to set my fence on my table saw and cut all of the sides for all boxes in one go to ensure that they're all the same height. And when assembling the boxes to one another, I needed to make sure to keep the tops and bottoms flat, so I used the top of my table saw as a reference since it's the only truly flat surface I currently had in the shop. Then came the very satisfying step of placing all the puzzle pieces together on the base. For the top, I'm going to be using 2 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood laminated together and covered with a layer of Formica. I have since learned it's easier to ensure a super flat top with MDF, and it's what I switched to for later builds, but that lesson hadn't been learned yet at the time of doing this. While I was able to manhandle the slightly warped plywood sheets mostly into submission, MDF is easier to flatten and level out. I've never used Formica before, but it seemed easy enough. The trickiest part was how cumbersome the giant roll is. I started by cutting it with my circular saw, but that seemed overkill and actually ruined some edges for me, so I ended up switching to a sharp utility knife, which is what I would recommend. I cut my sheet a little larger than the tabletop, so I have some wiggle room when it comes to placement. Then I just added contact cement to both sides and let it cure until the surface on both the plywood and the Formica is no longer tacky. Then I just added some spacer strips to the plywood and carefully placed the Formica on top. It's important to use dowels or some type of spacer when placing the Formica down because once it touches the surface it sticks and there's no getting it off. So with the spacer sticks in place, I could adjust my alignment carefully before removing the spacers and pressing down the Formica. I started in the center and worked my way to one side and then to the next, pressing it down firmly and then going over the whole surface with a roller, making sure to apply enough pressure to ensure a nice and tight hold. Then I just trimmed off the excess along the edge with my router. After that, we installed the dust hose and outlet, and the table was ready to use. The cherry on the sundae was just some T-tracks I added so that I have a way to clamp and hold workpieces down to the top. I just used a flat board as a straight edge and used my handheld router to cut out some grooves that the T-track can slide into. In case you're unfamiliar with what a T-track system is, it allows you to use a special bolt that slides into the channel and works with clamping accessories. But I wanted my T-track buried in the surface of the top without cutting into the front edge of the tabletop, because it felt like that might ruin the look of it. So I had to cut out a slot in each track that will allow me to slip accessories into the track midstream without having an open track end to work with. This was pretty easily achieved with my Dremel tool since these tracks are made out of aluminum. With everything cut to size, I just screwed the tracks into the grooves and my table was ready to use. Here's an example of how some of my T-track accessories work. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see how I build the router table cabinet and a more in-depth look at cabinet building and drawer construction, subscribe and stay tuned for our next release.